Well, the pallets are torn down, and I'm hoping that that was the hard part of this project. The next step for me is to rip these boards and cross-cut them to length. Now, this is probably the pile of boards that are going to give me the most work. Ultimately, what I want to do is have enough boards that I can cover the wall, but I've got some boards with issues. This one has a split. It doesn't go all the way through this board, so I may just leave this split in here. I have some that are essentially split in half. If I'm lucky, I'll be able to at least use part of this and rip this down to a smaller size. I don't want this paneling to be uniform in width, so I'm okay with smaller versus larger pieces. Some of the other issues I'm going to be dealing with are boards that are just plain beat up. I don't know if I can actually salvage this board. It's pretty rough. Even though I do like this live edge look, this is not going to work with the paneling, so that will be ripped off. And then of course I have knots, which if they're intact like this, it's not going to be a big deal. I've also got some knots that are on the edge. My plan is to bevel the edges at 45 degrees and kind of offset them. So if I can use this and not bust that knot out, we should be okay. When I rip these boards for the paneling, I could very easily just rip down so that I have 90-degree edges, butt them up against each other on the wall, and then this would be my seam. There's a few reasons that I didn't really want to go this route. Number one is these boards are pretty rough and my cuts may not be perfectly straight. So you may be able to see some gaps in there and kind of really amplified. The other thing is sometimes you kind of lose the distinction between each board, and I want each board to kind of stand on its own. And probably the last and final thing is I want there to be a closure between this board and the next, and that way I won't see the wall behind it. So my plan is to take each board, and when I rip them, I'm going to rip a 45-degree on them so that I have this board, if there's any gaps, will cover up based on this wood behind here. Before I actually put these together, I'm going to take and soften these edges here, kind of these leading edges, with a 45-degree back cut. And I'll either cut those on the table saw, or I'll just take a hand plane or some sandpaper and just soften that edge. And then that way you'll actually have a visible seam between each board in the panel. Well, I was wrong. I thought tearing down the pallets was going to be the worst part of this project, but ripping those 45-degree bevels on both sides of these boards, that turned out to be a lot of work. I've got roughly 45 of these. They're 36 inches long, both sides. Do the math, tell me how far I had to go to get to this point. The next step is to soften this face edge of the 45 degree. The reason I want to do that, well, there's a couple. First off, I don't want this to be a seamless joint. I want there to be some distinction between each board. The other thing is, this is probably going to be a pretty fragile face, and it could damage, could get chipped or splinter, or who knows what's going to happen over the years. So I want to soften that essentially so that we have this, which this is roughly 45 degrees back up towards the face. And then when I put those together, you can kind of see that that makes a nice seam there. Each board is distinct. Now, I spent a lot of hours at the table saw ripping these down. I was ready for a change. I'm going to slow things down a little bit. You could do this a number of ways. I'm going to do this with a hand plane. If you wanted to, you could go back to the table saw, set it up to rip that 45 degree off. You could use a sander, a jointer, a router. It just depends on what you want to do. So here's my panel on the floor, of course, and I think I've got enough boards. I needed about 13 feet, and I think with the end pieces here I've got about 14 feet. So that gives me a little bit of slack to play with. So the next step on this is to square up the ends and cut all these boards to the same length. To determine the length, I'm just going to find the shortest board, and that may not necessarily be the shortest in length. I have to look at the ends, figure out if there are really any bad ones, cut them off square, and then I'll basically use that shortest board as my reference. I'm not going for a super nice finish on this sanding. I just want to get rid of the slivers, the real rough spots, and all the blemishes. And now the fun part. Let's put a finish on these boards.